All right, so let's get started with the lesson on how to play the aerator, the part of the instrument that produces the air pressure we need to generate tone here in the intonator. Okay, but before we start into the details of this part of the instrument, I want to do a quick visit to the instrument as a whole. I want to do it from the perspective of what I like to call having the end in mind. So the idea is, if we know what we want in the end, we can work backwards from that, and it helps us to identify the things we do in playing the instrument that contribute to achieving the end that we're after, as opposed to the things we're doing with the instrument that might detract or take away from the desired output. Okay, so what is the desired output? Well, whether we're singing or speaking, what we're trying to do is create a great sound. Okay, we're trying to wow the listener, the audience. We're trying to create a very high quality tone that also contains within it the emotional impact that we're after. And how does that happen mechanically? Well, these sounds that we're creating are encapsulated into sound waves that eventually arrive at the eardrums of the listener, whether directly in a live performance, or they might get recorded by a microphone and then later played back. But either way, what we have are these encapsulated sound waves that are very complex, that contain within them, when they're sort of opened and unpacked and sent to the ears of the listener, they contain within them either this beautiful sound and this emotional sound that we're trying to convey, or they don't, depending on how we play the instrument. So let's take a moment to think about and understand what exactly are sound waves, how they're created, and how they might be altered for better or for worse within the instrument on their way to the listener's ears. So sound waves in the vocal instrument are created when the air pressure meets the vocal folds inside the larynx or the voice box or the intonator right here in the throat. Okay, you might be familiar, some of you, with them being called vocal cords. It's the same thing. It's just these days, especially in the voice arts, they're referred to as vocal folds. So let's quickly we'll talk about them more later, but the vocal folds are essentially two organic membranes with a lot of muscle in them that press against each other. And when they're pressing against each other, they resist air. They won't let the upcoming air move them. But what will happen is when the air pressure is enough, they will pop open and they'll let some air out, and then they'll close. And then the pressure builds up and they pop open again and they let some air out. Well, what's actually happening when we sing is, depending on what pitch we're singing, what note we're singing, they'll be opening and closing anywhere between 200 and 2,000 times a second. So it's what we call vibrating or oscillating. What you're doing is using air pressure to create a vibration at the vocal folds. Okay. Then what we have at that point is, on those vibrations, this opening and closing, each time it opens and closes, it creates one wave, one sound wave. So what you have is a steady stream of 200 to 2,000 sound waves created per second. And at this point, they're moving through the air, but they're no longer part of the air. So the air that's coming out of your mouth or out of your nose as a result of this exhale that's producing tone is not the sound. The sound waves are moving through it at this point. And sound waves not only move through air, but they can move through more solid surfaces, as I'll talk about in a minute. So what's happening is the sound waves are coming up, the air is coming up, they hit the vocal folds here, and then the sound waves are moving up. What actually happens is sound waves would move in 360 degrees. So I'll show you in a second, if I have a balloon And I feel if you've ever taken a balloon and filled it up and then stretched the neck to make a sound, that sound is not, even though the air pressure is coming up from below, that sound is actually coming out in all directions, including straight up and out at angles and out at 90 degrees. What happens in the tube above, so we have a little bit more of the larynx or the voice box above the vocal folds. Then we have what I call the entrance to the resonation chamber or the resonator, the little bit more of the air passage, and then it moves into the mouth and nasal passages and the resonation chamber altogether. Well, what happens in this little bit of the tube here is some of the sound wants to move out horizontally or diagonally. Some of the sound is just going straight up, like the main point of the wave is going to go straight up, uninhibited. It won't bounce onto anything until it's up in the back of the throat, the back of the mouth. Some of the sound is going to move out, and because the throat is somewhat, it's a hard surface, but it's not a super hard surface. So some of that sound is going to pass out of the tube and get absorbed by the muscles and skin of the neck. Some of it's going to reflect within the tube and continue to move up. It's going to kind of bounce back and forth on its way up. So what you have is some sound waves moving straight, uninhibited up, other sound waves that are moving up and kind of bouncing around. And what you end up with is you can really consider it as a type of laser-like beam of sound waves. And again, they only produce sound inside somebody's ears, but so they're really potential sound. And you have these sound waves that are now being sort of swirled around and focused into a tube-like laser beam moving vertically. Okay, then we have what happens next. Well, it really depends on how we've positioned the different parts within the resonator. But I would say pick one main event that happens of all these different events that happen up in the resonation chamber, is that at some point you have what's called the soft palate. So the soft palate is the roof of your mouth. Usually the roof of your mouth is described as being the hard palate divided into the hard palate and the soft palate. So what is that? So the roof of your mouth closest to your teeth, of course, you know, it's much harder than the very back. If you were to move your tongue back, you don't want to gag, but you can feel it with your finger as well, is that your roof of your mouth, so if my teeth were out here, the roof of the mouth is thicker. There's more bone and the bone is thicker here. As it traces back down here toward the back of the throat, it gets thinner. There's less bone, and I think at the end it's mostly cartilage. I'm not sure if it's thin bone or cartilage, but it's soft and flexible. And that little bag, the uvula that hangs down, is actually the end of your soft palate. So in vocal training and voice work, we tend to use the word soft palate as opposed to the roof of your mouth. Sometimes you'll hear the word velum. The word velum, if you hear something in velum referring to singing, they're talking about the soft palate or the back of the roof of your mouth. Okay, another major event when we're producing these sound waves is when those waves that are coming up in this laser beam-like direction strike the back of the roof of the mouth, strike the soft palate, and get directed out your mouth, as well as directed up into your head. But what can happen is that soft palate also collapses down to let you breathe through your nose, inhale and exhale through your nose. So the soft palate can be down, and those sound waves, some or all of them, will pass up into the nasal passages and come out the nose and the face, whereas if the soft palate is raised and it's firm, if it's raised all the way, it's going to press up against the back of your throat, and that's going to cause the sound waves to strike the soft palate and get directed mostly out your mouth. Not entirely, but mostly out your mouth. So when we're, again, talking about this bigger picture of having the end in mind, what else can happen with these sound waves? Well, sound waves strike surfaces, okay? So when a sound wave strikes a very, very hard surface, like a rock wall or a piece of granite wall or a marble wall, Like maybe you've been out camping and you've been in a place that has a really big hard rock wall and you've yelled something and you've heard your echo come back. And the harder that surface is, the more accurate, when the sound comes back, and it's going to sound very accurate to what the sound was that left your mouth. So all of the sound is being reflected. Now, what can actually happen is sound can also be absorbed. So let's say you're in a recording studio. They go to a great extent. They don't want any reflections off the walls. So they'll put up different thicknesses and different types of materials that will absorb. Some of them are designed to absorb the lower frequencies. Some are designed to record the middle and the high frequencies, or absorb such that there's no reflection. So what happens is when we sing, because this instrument, especially the resonation chamber, isn't solid and fixed, it's actually, in fact, all three parts they're organic, they're shape-shifting, which is what makes the voice so amazing. But at the same time, if we're not consciously playing those parts correctly, we can end up with, for example, in the resonation chamber, if everything is flaccid and relaxed too much, to too high of a degree, it's going to absorb the sound. All these sound waves that we've gone to great lengths to create here in the bottom to be of a high quality will get absorbed or reflected in ways we don't want. And so when they finally leave the head, because this is the only portion that's within our control as a creator of sound, is where the sound wave is created to the point where it leaves the head. And at that point, it's out of our control. So what we're trying to do is produce the highest quality tone we can. So to explain that or elaborate upon that, there's an expression, I remember it from software development, but you hear it elsewhere. And this expression is garbage in, garbage out, right? Garbage in, garbage out. In software, this applied, like if you were creating a form for someone to enter a 10-digit phone number, you build in the safety checks to make sure that they actually enter 10 numbers. Otherwise, it could enter, the word puppy and their phone number would say puppy instead of the numbers. So what you do is you try to control the garbage coming in. So how does this affect singing? Well, what happens is the resonation chamber takes an input. It takes the initial tone that was created and it amplifies it. It adds harmonics. It might soften it. In the case of singing, it will create vowels. It will alter the vowels. And what the resonation chamber is able to do to the sound is only as good as the quality of the sound that came into it. So let's look at another musical instrument. Look at the body of a guitar, or a guitar, let's say. So the body of the guitar is the resonation chamber, but the sound that goes into it comes off the strings when the string is plucked. So for example, anyone who's played guitar knows this, if you have very old guitar strings, for example, over time, the sound that comes off those strings just gets duller and duller. There's less volume, there's less harmonics. And at that point, it doesn't matter. You can have the most expensive guitar in the world, the most beautiful guitar in the world. If the strings are old and worn out, you're in a garbage in, garbage out situation, right? And so what we're trying to do when we produce tone with a voice is this point is critical. So as we learn, again, as we move forward into our vocal training and learn to play these different parts, and we learn to, of course, play them together as well, that one of the most important events, the critical event, is the creation of tone. We want this to be created with the highest possible quality as we can within our power at the moment we're making sound. Another expression that comes from audio engineering, you hear this expression, fix it in the mix. So fix it in the mix is the same way as if the original sound is compromised in some way or of a lower quality, then you actually have to work through equalization or changes in volume or pitch correction, for example, because pitch is created here as well. Correcting the pitch later are things that have to be done because there was a garbage in situation. So what we're trying to do when we play the instrument as a whole, so let's just recap this. When we're playing the instrument as a whole, we have the listener or the end in mind. We want the highest quality sound as we possibly can. We want all that emotional impact as well. So all of that information is contained in these sound waves that happen between the vocal folds and then where they exit the head, the mouth, the nose, and the face. Okay? We want that to be as high a quality as possible, so we want to make sure we're creating great tone here at the vocal folds, and we want to make sure, and we'll learn this in a future lesson within this course, that the different moving parts of the resonator are all in place and active and contributing in a positive way to this sound we're creating, these sound waves we're creating and sending out into space. And although there's many moving parts in the resonator, the one thing I just kind of want to plant a seed here for you to keep in mind is one of the very most important events is this second event. So you have the tone created here, creates this laser beam-like cylinder of sound waves. And the next event is really, if everything's done correctly, is when those sound waves strike the soft palate in the back of the throat and get reflected rather than absorbed. We want a really nice firm surface back there, and we want them to reflect, add all the harmonics that can be added within this resonation chamber so that we're sending the highest quality sound as we possibly can out of our mouth. Okay, so that's the introduction to the instrument as a whole. Now we're going to move toward understanding this first part, the production of air pressure within the part of the instrument that I call the aerator. Okay, so let's move into talking about air production and the aerator. We're still not quite going to get our hands dirty. Let's talk about this part of the instrument in general, and then we're going to move a little more toward how it actually works, and we'll get into some exercises pretty quick. What I want to talk about first is, let's just recap, is that the purpose of this portion of the instrument is to provide a steady and firm pressure to the vocal folds. Now, when we get into the lesson on the intonator, well, there's quite a few moving parts inside the intonator, but for the purpose of learning how to, what I call, play the airbags, or I sometimes call it airflow production, playing the airbags, and I refer to more the noun, the name of this portion of the instrument as the aerator. Okay, so for the purpose of learning how to play the aerator, we're just going to see the vocal folds as these two kind of muscular membranes that come together. They receive the air pressure to a point where when there's enough steady and firm air pressure, they open and close and enter a state of vibration. And that state of vibration can be very short. Again, each syllable I speak is a brief moment of vibration. When we sing, we might sustain a note, and so the portion of time when they're in a state of vibration is longer. Okay, so what we're doing is providing this steady, firm air pressure. Well, what happens also, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the lesson about the intonator, is that remember that these vocal folds, they're organic and they're shape-shifting, meaning they can become thicker and thinner, they can stretch, they can become tighter, in their stretching, or looser, and they can even tip at an angle, so there's different angles they can take. And what happens is, though we want firm air pressure, we don't want fixed firmness. So the amount of air pressure that we're going to put into the vocal folds has to work with the vocal folds in the state they're in. So if the vocal folds are very strong and thick and pressed together, we actually need a stronger air pressure to open them, to move them and open them. But if we're using that strong, firm, extra strong, extra firm air pressure from down here, and the folds are thinner and they're pressing together, but it's not a bad thing because they produce a tone that we desire. Like we want a thinner and lighter tone at a higher pitch. Well, if we have that really big, firm, strong air pressure, it's going to blow right through that. It's going to create a pushing or a blasting sound. And there may be moments stylistically that you want briefly some kind of sound effect. But in general, what's going to happen is the amount of air pressure we put into the folds is related to how much air pressure the folds want to receive, in effect, to produce the sound and the emotion that we're after as we're making tone. So what I like to do, and we'll talk about this throughout this whole course and into the training course, is for each of these moving parts within the instrument, the three sections of the instrument, I usually like to create a scale, a numbered scale, to help guide in terms of the scale is going to depend. So for example, on air pressure, usually what I'm trying to do is I go, most every part is going to have some type of neutral or medium status or value, because it depends on the instrument. You'll see in a second. So I usually like to call that neutral position 0. And then we'll go either to 5 or to -5. Now, it doesn't mean that negative is bad. It doesn't mean it's not a good or bad thing. It's just usually, so for example, if we say the opening in the jaw, there's a medium opening, we might just say +5 means it's a bigger opening, and -5 means it's closer. Like -5 would be probably practically closed. So when we're talking about that with the amount of air pressure, not only the amount of air pressure, but we'll get into this in a minute, the amount of muscle activation in and around the aerator as well. 0 is just steady, firm. We'll say like kind of a medium firmness. It's really, we'll do exercises later. It's your basic firm pressure. We go to +5 means very strong, very active muscles and a good amount of air pressure, more air pressure. And really to reach a proper level of 4 or 5 air pressure requires that the vocal folds are very well trained and very strong. So technically a beginner probably couldn't even achieve a pressure of 4 or 5 because it also requires developing these muscles. But we move from 0 to 5 in sort of a growing muscle activation and growing pressure, and from 0 to -5 in as we use less pressure. Now, as I said, with other parameters, moving negative or positive isn't necessarily a good or bad thing. However, when we talk about muscle activation and using the aerator, we almost always want to stay on the positive side. So from 0 is okay, is just that nice medium pressure, up to 1, 2, or 3 before we even learn or develop our muscles to a point where we can really slam a 4 or 5 without hurting ourselves. So we really want to be between, say, 0 and 2 as a beginner or medium student, and working on that 3 as we develop and grow. Okay, so that is kind of the basic part about the purpose of the aerator. Now, let me give you a quick demonstration of how this works. And this is kind of silly, but it's if you've ever made sound with a balloon, this is essentially the two parts of the instrument, the aerator and the intonator, with the resonator removed. It's as if your head were removed. So the vocal folds are two-sided, and they're self-stretching. I mean, they stretch and they get thicker, and so you can change the pitch and the quality of the tone just by the way you position the vocal folds. Well, you can also make changes into the volume and the quality of the tone by how much air pressure you apply. So I'm going to use the palms of my hands to see if I can push in on the balloon and send a little more air into the sound maker there. You can actually hear that kind of that blasting fry sound when too much air is being pushed past those folds. So that balloon is kind of an example of how the air pressure meets the folds, but how both parts move. You can create more pressure or less pressure, and you can stretch and alter the two sides of the vibrating part that creates these sound waves that we're after. Okay, so now before we move on, I want to now make a distinction that's very important, and it is something I call the singer's phrase. Okay, so what I want to do, we use this a lot in our training, not only in this course, but in the next course. And I create this distinction as being separate from what we usually think of as a phrase when we're singing, which is usually a lyrical phrase. So what happens with a lyrical phrase is it's usually one line of poetry or one line of the lyric of the song. But when we're singing, sometimes we might sing 2 or 3 phrases with the same breath, or sometimes we might sing a half a phrase, and then we need to inhale and take a breath before we sing the second half of the lyrical phrase. So when I use the word phrase, sometimes I'll just say phrase, but I'll sometimes sing singer's phrase in this course. What I'm really referring to is one complete cycle of the inhale and exhale, right? So, and everything that happens in between. We make sound on the exhale, then we inhale and we prepare. And that one cycle is what I call a singer's phrase. Okay, so when we're going to learn how to use the aerator and produce this nice, steady and firm air pressure, we want to actually examine this singer's phrase, and we want to break it down into 4 pieces. There's 4 components. You'd tend to think of there being 2, the inhale and the exhale, but I really like to see it as 4. So what you have is, let's say you can start anywhere, kind of arbitrarily, but let's start with the inhale. We have the inhale, but a very important part of singing is the transition from inhale to exhale as sort of a separate part of this cycle of breathing, this singer's phrase. Then you have the exhale, and then you have a brief moment where you transition from exhale to inhale. Okay, and those 4 steps completed constitute one singer's phrase. All right, so hold that thought. Okay. All right, so now that I've said a couple dozen times that there are 3 parts to this instrument of the voice, I want to introduce briefly a 4th part, and then we'll go back to having only 3 parts. What I'm really talking about is the container of the instrument, and the key word to the container is posture. So the container is really the legs and the hips and the spinal column that hold up and support the instrument, the three parts of the instrument. So how do we establish good posture for singing? We'll just go through this real quick, and then as we go through the course, when I say, establish good posture, you'll know what we're talking about. So generally, you already know what good posture is. You want to be up very straight. You want your shoulders open, your chest open and up, but you also want your shoulders to be relaxed. You don't want anything up in here clenched or tense. You don't want really anything in your body clenched. Nothing is clenched. Some things might be intense or active, but nothing is squeezing or clenching. Okay, so just stand up if you can and do this with me. All we're really going to do is just stand up very tall and straight. We'll let the shoulders kind of drop in place. There's all kinds of ways it can get very complex to establishing posture, but we're just going to go through the basics. Besides being up and straight and open and relaxed, one important part about posture is that we want the pelvic area, the hips, to be straight. A lot of people have a problem. Usually they can either be too far tilted forward or like thrusted forward, or they can be withdrawn and pulled back, which puts like an extra arc in the lower back. Probably 99% of people that might have a problem with posture, it's going to be pulled back. It's going to be the pelvic is tipped back too far. What will happen is if the pelvic is tipped back too far, it's going to throw off the alignment of the upper body as well. And ultimately what that's going to cause is usually the head is forward and tipped downward. And what we end up doing, because we like our face to be at 90 degrees or would that be perpendicular to the floor, the head tends to raise up, and now you get a little bit of a crook in your neck as well. So, and that becomes normal. So sometimes someone says, well, stand up straight with good posture, but some people don't, it's become so habitual, they don't realize that they can do even better. So, and one thing I want to add is that with singing, is that when you're in your lower range, you're in like the safer range, the margin of error is larger. You can make errors in all the different moving parts, the tongue, the jaw, the soft palate, some of the breath support here in the gut region, as well as the posture. You can be off by a little bit and it's not so obvious in terms of the sound. It doesn't compromise it. But when you get up into your higher range, those higher notes, and there's a lot of intensity there, the margin of error is very, very small. So sometimes just the slightest improvement in your posture can make the difference between actually hitting a high note accurately with good sound or not. So a great thing we can do to bring this part, the part here in the pelvis, flush, is to quickly just raise up about an inch. You don't need more than an inch. Your heels, raise up on your toes, raise your heels off the floor, and then just let your whole body fall and kind of bang on the floor. And you do this a couple of times, and it seems to automatically realign this pelvic hip to be flush. And so you want to feel this flat area here coming straight down to your legs to be nice and flush. That's what we're after, okay? So if you do that, you've got that part of it straight. Now the neck part, there's a nice little kind of mental image or exercise you can do is you imagine that there's a rope connected to this back high point of your head. This is the highest point of your body, and it's pretty much directly above your spinal column. So imagine if there's a rope that you're hanging from this rope, or that you're being pulled up by the rope, and it's basically stretching out and elongating your spinal column, as well as what's really important is the back of your neck becomes flat. So what happens is for people who habitually have their, and I'm one of them, have their pelvis tilted back and then their head comes forward and up, when they're actually got their posture correct, sometimes it can feel like it's not correct. It can feel like you're looking down too much or your head is tilted down too much, but it's actually in the proper position. So if you just bang your heels here a little bit and imagine this rope kind of pulling up and stretching out your spine and the back of your neck, keep the chest open, the shoulders, down and strong. You're already in really good shape. The last little piece you can add is still keep your knees a little soft and flexible and make sure the hips can rotate and the shoulders can rotate. Keep all that kind of limber, but at the same time, don't let the pelvic girdle, the pelvic region, tip back or too far forward, and don't let the head or neck squish up. And we'll talk about these a little more in greater detail as they correspond to the different parts of the instrument we're singing. But the fourth part, to summarize, the fourth part is the container of the instrument, and it's related to our posture. And so what we want to do is get a good posture set up. And we're not going to make sound quite yet. We're going to do it in the next section. But get that posture really good and know that the posture becomes more and more important, as everything does. The posture becomes very important as you develop the higher range of your voice, the more challenging range of your voice. You have less margin of error, and you need all these little details to line up that can really make a big difference. Okay, so let's move on.